And there had been those strange details, the way his skin had seemed to glow in the shop's fluorescent lights, how cold his hands had been, the fact that she could have sworn he cast no reflection in the window. Elena was so lost in thought that she didn't notice where her feet were taking her until she looked up and found herself standing outside a sleek glass building in the heart of the financial district. The address matched the one on Adrian's business card. Blackwood Enterprises occupied the top 3 floors of the 40-story tower, according to the directory in the lobby. Elena stared up at the building, wondering what impulse had brought her here. She certainly couldn't just walk in and ask to see Adrian. She had no business with him anymore, no reason to intrude on what was probably the worst day of his life. The smart thing would be to go home and forget all about her mysterious client. Instead, Elena found herself pushing through the revolving doors and approaching the security desk. The lobby was all marble and chrome, intimidating in its modern elegance. The security guard, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, looked up from his newspaper, the same edition Elena had bought, she noticed. "Can I help you, miss? I need to see Adrian Blackwood," Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's about some work I did for him." The guard's expression grew sympathetic. "I'm afraid Mr. Blackwood isn't seeing anyone today. He came in this morning, but he's given strict instructions not to be disturbed. Maybe you could come back tomorrow?" Elena nodded, feeling foolish. Of course, Adrian wouldn't want to see anyone. He was probably dealing with lawyers, angry family members, and the fallout from abandoning his fiancée. The last thing he needed was a confused seamstress showing up without an appointment. She was turning to leave when the elevator doors opened and Adrian himself stepped out. He looked haggard, his usually perfect appearance disheveled. His hair was mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it, his tie was loose, and there were dark circles under his eyes. But when he saw Elena standing in the lobby, his entire demeanor changed. "Elena," he said, and her name sounded like a prayer on his lips. "What are you doing here?" I saw the newspaper," she said helplessly. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Something shifted in Adrian's expression, a vulnerability that made him look younger and more human than the polished businessman she'd met the day before. "You came to check on me?" Elena nodded, acutely aware that the security guard was watching their exchange with undisguised curiosity. "I know it's not my place, but you seemed— When you came to the shop yesterday, you seemed troubled. I was worried." Adrian stared at her for a long moment as if trying to solve a puzzle. Then he turned to the security guard. "Thomas, this is Elena Rodriguez. Please add her to my approved visitor list, effective immediately." "Yes, sir, Mr. Blackwood." Adrian looked back at Elena, his dark eyes intense. "Would you come up with me? I think we need to talk." Elena knew she should say no. She should make some polite excuse and go back to her simple life away from whatever complicated situation Adrian was in. Instead, she found herself nodding and following him into the elevator. The ride to the 40th floor was silent, but Elena was intensely aware of Adrian standing beside her. He seemed to radiate a strange energy, and she noticed again how his skin appeared to have an almost luminous quality under the elevator's lights. When the doors opened, she followed him down a hallway lined with expensive artwork and into an office that took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seattle. From the Space Needle to Elliott Bay, the office itself was decorated in dark wood and leather, elegant but somehow cold, like a museum display rather than a workspace. Adrian gestured for Elena to sit in one of the chairs facing his massive desk, but remained standing himself, pacing to the windows. "I suppose you think I'm a coward," he said without turning around, "running away from my wedding like that." "I think you did what you felt you had to do," Elena replied carefully. "Though I imagine it was difficult for everyone involved." Adrian laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Victoria is furious, as she has every right to be. Her father is threatening to sue me for breach of contract. Apparently, our engagement was as much a business arrangement as it was personal. My own board of directors is in crisis mode, worried about how this will affect company stock prices." "But you're not sorry," Elena said quietly. It wasn't a question. Adrian turned to face her, his expression surprised. "How did you know the way you said wedding yesterday? Like it was something you were dreading rather than celebrating. And now, You look tired, stressed, but not regretful. Adrian moved away from the windows and sat on the edge of his desk, closer to Elena than was strictly professional. You're very perceptive. No, I'm not sorry. I couldn't go through with it. I realized that marrying Victoria would have been the biggest mistake of my life. What changed your mind? For a moment, Adrian was silent, his dark eyes studying Elena's face with an intensity that made her squirm in her chair. You did, he said finally. Elena's breath caught. Me? But we barely know each other. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. Sometimes 10 minutes is enough, Adrian said softly. Do you know what I was thinking about when I was supposed to be walking down the aisle to marry Victoria? Elena shook her head, not trusting her voice. I was thinking about the way you looked when you examined my tie, the concentration on your face, the gentleness of your hands, the way you spoke to me. Not like I was Adrian Blackwood's CEO, but just like I was a person who needed help. Do you have any idea how rare that is in my world? Adrian, Elena began, but he held up a hand. Let me finish. I was thinking about how you made something beautiful from something that was ruined. How you took time and care with a stranger's problem, even though you clearly have struggles of your own. I realized that I wanted to be around someone who still believed in fixing things instead of just throwing them away. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. You can't base life-changing decisions on one encounter with a seamstress you don't know, can't I? Adrian moved from the desk to the chair beside hers, his proximity making her pulse race. Elena, I've lived a very long time, and I've learned to trust my instincts about people. There's something special about you, something that calls to me in a way I can't explain. How long? Elena asked suddenly. You said you've lived a very long time. How old are you? Adrian went very still, and Elena saw something like fear flicker across his features. Older than I look, he said carefully. Elena thought about the strange details she'd noticed, his luminous skin, his cold hands, the missing reflection in the window. A crazy thought began to form in her mind, too impossible to be true yet somehow fitting all the pieces together. Adrian, she said slowly, what exactly are you? The question hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Adrian's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally resignation. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, he said quietly. Try me. Adrian was silent for so long that Elena thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I'm a vampire, Elena. I've been 32 years old for almost 200 years. Elena stared at him, waiting for the punchline or the explanation that would make this make sense. When neither came, she found herself cataloging everything unusual she'd noticed about him. The pale, luminous skin, the cold touch, the way he'd appeared in the shop so quickly after her call, faster than should have been possible. The missing reflection in the window. That's impossible, she said, but even as she spoke the words, part of her was accepting them as truth. I know how it sounds, Adrian said urgently. I know you have no reason to believe me. But, Elena, I haven't felt anything real in decades. I was going through the motions of life, doing what was expected of me, until I met you. You looked at me like I was just a man who needed help, not a monster or a business opportunity. Do you have any idea what that meant to me? Elena's mind was reeling. Vampires were supposed to be myths, stories told to frighten children. They weren't supposed to be successful businessmen who ran companies and got engaged to society daughters. They weren't supposed to have sad, beautiful eyes and gentle voices that made her want to comfort them. Prove it, she said suddenly. Adrian looked surprised. What? If you're really a vampire, prove it. Show me something that will make me believe. Adrian hesitated, then stood and moved back to the windows. Are you sure? Once you see, you can't unsee. Your life will never be quite the same. Elena thought about her small apartment, her endless financial struggles, her quiet life of routine and loneliness. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Adrian nodded slowly, then turned away from her. When he turned back, Elena gasped. His eyes had changed completely. Instead of the warm brown she remembered, they were now golden, almost glowing with their own inner light. His canine teeth had lengthened into sharp points that glinted when he spoke. Most dramatically, his skin seemed to radiate a pale luminescence as if lit from within. "This is what I am," Adrian said, his voice slightly distorted by his changed teeth. "This is why I live in shadows, why I can never have a normal life with a normal woman. This is why I was willing to marry Victoria even though I felt nothing for her, because I thought it was the closest to human happiness I would ever get." Elena should have been terrified. Every instinct should have been screaming at her to run, to get away from this creature that couldn't possibly exist. Instead, she found herself standing and moving toward him. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly, reaching out to touch his luminous cheek. Adrian flinched as if her touch burned, but didn't pull away. "Does what hurt? Being what you are. Being alone. Every day," Adrian whispered, his transformed eyes closing at her gentle touch. "Elena, you should be afraid of me. You should be running." "Should I?" Elena studied his face, seeing past the supernatural changes to the loneliness and longing beneath. "You're still the same man who was gentle with Mrs. Chen, who said please and thank you, who trusted me with something precious to him. Being a vampire doesn't make you a monster, Adrian." Adrian's eyes snapped open, the golden glow intensifying. "How can you say that? Do you know what I am? What I've done? I know you've lived for 200 years and managed to become successful without losing your humanity. I know you called off a wedding rather than trap someone in a loveless marriage. I know you look at me like I'm something wonderful instead of something broken." Elena's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "I don't care what you are, Adrian. I care who you are." For a long moment they stood frozen, Elena's hand on Adrian's cheek, both of them breathing hard despite the fact that Adrian probably didn't need to breathe at all. Then Adrian was moving, his arms coming around Elena, pulling her close as his mouth found hers. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if Adrian was afraid of his own strength. But when Elena responded, her arms sliding around his neck, he deepened the kiss with a hunger that spoke of years of loneliness and longing. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling. Adrian's appearance had returned to normal, but his eyes still held that golden glow. "Elena," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I can't offer you a normal life. I can't give you children, grow old with you, or even be seen with you in daylight without careful preparation. Being with me would mean danger, secrecy, a world you never imagined existed." Elena smiled, her hand still resting on his cheek. "I've been living half a life, Adrian, just getting by, just surviving. Maybe it's time I tried something extraordinary." Adrian stared at her for a long moment, then pulled her close again, burying his face in her hair. "You have no idea what you're saying yes to," he murmured. "Then show me," Elena whispered back. "I want to see your world. All of it windows." Outside the office windows, the sun was beginning to set over Seattle, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Elena Rodriguez, who had woken up that morning as a struggling seamstress worried about rent money, was now standing in the arms of a vampire CEO, ready to step into a world she'd never dreamed existed. The newspaper on Adrian's desk still bore the headline about his ruined wedding, but Elena no longer thought of it as a scandal. It was a beginning, a choice that had freed them both to discover what they could be together. As Adrian held her close, Elena realized that sometimes the most important repairs weren't done with needle and thread, but with courage, acceptance, and the willingness to see beauty in something that others might consider broken. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, Elena was certain. Adrian's world would be full of dangers and complications she couldn't yet imagine. But for now, standing in his arms as the city lights began to twinkle below them, Elena felt like she was finally truly alive for the first time in years. Elena's transformation from struggling seamstress to the companion of a vampire CEO didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without its challenges. The first few weeks after Adrian's revelation were a whirlwind of discovery, adjustment, and moments of doubt that tested both of their resolves. Adrian had been right about the complications. Elena learned that his world was far more complex and dangerous than she had imagined. Blackwood Enterprises wasn't just a successful corporation. It was a carefully constructed front that allowed Adrian to move freely in human society while managing a vast network of supernatural businesses and maintaining the delicate balance between the vampire community and the mortal world. The night after their first kiss, Adrian took Elena to his real home, not the sterile penthouse apartment listed as his official address, but a beautiful Victorian mansion hidden in the hills above the city. The house had been in his family for generations, purchased when Seattle was still a frontier town and carefully maintained through the decades. "This is where I actually live," Adrian said as he led her through rooms filled with antiques and artwork from around the world. "The penthouse is for appearances, board meetings, business entertaining. This is where I can be myself." Elena wandered through the house in amazement, running her fingers along silk wallpaper and examining paintings that belonged in museums. Everything was beautiful but somehow melancholy, like a perfectly preserved memory of better times. "It's lonely," she said suddenly, and Adrian stopped walking. "What?" Elena turned to face him in the grand living room, with its soaring ceilings and magnificent fireplace. "This house, it's gorgeous, but it feels lonely. Like a place where someone has been waiting for a very long time." Adrian's expression grew soft. "You see too much," he said quietly. "Yes, it's been lonely. I've lived here alone for nearly a century, keeping everything perfect, maintaining it all for no one but myself." "Why?" Adrian was quiet for a moment, staring into the cold fireplace. "Because hope dies hard, I suppose. Even when you're immortal and you should know better, some part of you keeps believing that someday someone will come along who will make it all worthwhile." Elena felt her heart constrict at the sadness in his voice. She moved to his side and took his cold hand in both of hers. "Well, now you don't have to wait anymore." That first month was filled with revelations that challenged everything Elena thought she knew about the world. Adrian introduced her carefully to the supernatural community that existed parallel to human society. Vampires, yes, but also werewolves, witches, and other beings she'd never imagined were real. She met Marcus Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew, who turned out to be a powerful witch who helped maintain the magical wards that protected Adrian's various properties. She discovered that her favorite coffee shop was owned by a family of werewolves, and that the elegant gallery where Adrian sometimes purchased artwork was run by a vampire who had been creating masterpieces for over 500 years. "How do you keep it all secret?" Elena asked one evening as they sat in Adrian's study, her curled up in his lap while he read through business reports that detailed both mundane corporate matters and supernatural territorial disputes. "Very carefully," Adrian replied, his fingers absently stroking her hair. "And with a great deal of money. Humans see what they expect to see, and most of them expect a world that makes logical sense. As long as we don't give them reason to look too closely, they explain away anything unusual." "What about the government?" "Surely someone official knows." Adrian's smile was grim. "Oh, they know. There are entire departments dedicated to monitoring and managing supernatural affairs, but it's a delicate balance. They need us as much as we need them. Vampires have been accumulating wealth and influence for centuries. We're woven into the fabric of human society in ways that would be impossible to extract without causing massive disruption." Elena was learning to navigate this strange new reality, but she was also learning about Adrian himself. The man behind the supernatural mystique was complex, carrying 2 centuries of experiences, losses, and accumulated wisdom. He was gentle with her, patient as she adjusted to the reality of dating someone who couldn't go out in direct sunlight without careful preparation, who didn't eat food, and whose body temperature ran several degrees colder than human normal. But there were darker aspects to Adrian's nature that he tried to shield her from. Elena gradually realized that despite his civilized appearance and careful control, Adrian was still a predator. He fed from blood bags obtained through medical contacts, but she could see the struggle it sometimes represented. She noticed how his eyes would track the pulse point in her neck when he was hungry, how he would excuse himself and return looking more composed but somehow more dangerous. "You're afraid of hurting me," Elena said one night when Adrian had been particularly careful not to touch her after returning from feeding. Terrified, Adrian admitted. Elena, you have no idea how strong I am, how easily I could damage you without meaning to. And when the hunger is on me, he shook his head. I would never forgive myself if I lost control with you. Elena had been thinking about this problem for weeks, and she'd come to a decision that she knew Adrian wouldn't like. What if you didn't have to control it? What if you fed from me? Adrian went absolutely still, his face losing what little color it normally had. No, absolutely not, Elena. I will not turn you into my personal blood bank. It wouldn't be like that, Elena insisted. Adrian, I've been reading about vampires, talking to Marcus about the supernatural bond between vampires and humans. What we have could be deeper, stronger. I could be your partner in every sense of the word. The risks. I know the risks. I also know that you've been denying a fundamental part of your nature to protect me, and it's tearing you apart. I can see it in your eyes, the way you hold yourself back. I don't want you to suffer for my sake. They argued about it for days. Adrian was adamant that he wouldn't endanger Elena by feeding from her, no matter how much sense it made from a supernatural perspective. Elena was equally determined that she wanted to fully accept all aspects of what Adrian was, including the parts that frightened her. The issue came to a head 3 weeks later when Adrian returned from a business trip to Portland looking haggard and strained. His usual blood supply had been contaminated, and he'd been without proper feeding for nearly a week. Elena could see the hunger in his golden eyes, the way his hands shook slightly when he thought she wasn't looking. "This is ridiculous," Elena said, cornering him in his study. "You're suffering, and for what? Some misguided attempt to protect me from something I'm willing to accept. Elena, please. I just need to make some phone calls, find another supplier." Elena moved closer, watching the way Adrian's nostrils flared slightly as her scent reached him. "Or you could stop being noble and let me help you." Before Adrian could protest, Elena had pulled her hair aside and tilted her neck, exposing the pulse point that she'd seen him watching so carefully. "Please, Adrian, let me do this for you." Adrian's control snapped. One moment he was across the room, the next he had Elena pinned against his desk, his face pressed against her neck, breathing hard. Elena could feel the sharp points of his fangs against her skin. "Elena," he whispered, his voice rough with need and desperation. "I could kill you. I could drain you dry and not even realize it until it was too late." "You won't," Elena said with absolute certainty. "You love me too much to hurt me." Adrian pulled back to look at her, his eyes glowing with that supernatural golden light. "How can you be so sure?" Elena cupped his face in her hands, seeing past the predatory hunger to the man she'd fallen in love with. "Because I know you. The real you, not just the vampire part, but all of you. You've spent 200 years learning control, Adrian. Trust yourself, trust us." For a long moment they stayed frozen in that tableau. Then Adrian's control broke entirely. His fangs sank into Elena's neck with surprising gentleness, and Elena gasped at the sensation. It wasn't painful, as she had feared it might be. Instead, there was a sharp sensation followed by the most incredible feeling of connection she had ever experienced. She could feel Adrian's emotions, his overwhelming love for her mixed with centuries of loneliness and pain. She could sense his careful restraint even in the midst of feeding, the way he monitored every drop to ensure he didn't take too much. When Adrian finally pulled away, Elena was dizzy but exhilarated. Adrian's appearance had changed dramatically. His skin had lost its pale, hungry cast and now glowed with health. His eyes were brighter, and he looked more alive than she'd ever seen him. "Elena," he breathed, licking the small wounds on her neck to help them heal. "Are you all right? How do you feel?" Elena smiled, testing her balance as she stood up straight. She felt different somehow, more aware of the world around her. She could hear sounds from outside that had never registered before, could smell scents with unusual clarity. Most importantly, she could still feel Adrian's emotions. A warm presence at the edge of her consciousness that told her she was loved beyond measure. "I feel wonderful," she said honestly, "connected to you in a way I never imagined possible." Adrian pulled her close, holding her with the desperate relief of someone who had expected disaster and found joy instead. "The bond," he said softly. "Marcus warned me this might happen. We're connected now, Elena, permanently. You'll be able to sense my emotions, my location, my well-being, and I'll be able to do the same with you. Is that bad?" "No," Adrian said, wonder in his voice. "No. It's the most beautiful thing that's ever happened to me." Their relationship deepened after that night. Elena moved into Adrian's Victorian mansion, officially as his live-in assistant, but really as his partner in every sense of the word. She learned to manage the supernatural aspects of his business empire, becoming his liaison with the human world while he handled more dangerous supernatural negotiations. Elena discovered she had a natural gift for diplomacy and mediation, skills that proved invaluable when dealing with supernatural creatures who had centuries of grudges against each other. Her human perspective and innate fairness made her a trusted neutral party in disputes that had been festering for decades. But perhaps most importantly, Elena brought warmth and life back to Adrian's existence. The lonely vampire who had been going through the motions of life found himself excited about the future for the first time in decades. Elena's laughter filled the empty rooms of his mansion. Her presence made every day worth experiencing. They faced challenges, of course. Victoria Ashford's father made several attempts to cause problems for Adrian's business interests, furious about the public humiliation of his daughter. The Vampire Council questioned Adrian's judgment in bonding with a human, warning him about the risks of exposure. There were other supernatural entities who saw Elena as a weakness to be exploited. But Adrian and Elena faced every challenge together. Adrian's centuries of experience and vast resources, combined with Elena's intuitive understanding of people and natural courage, made them formidable partners. They built something new together, not just a romance, but a true partnership that spanned both the human and supernatural worlds. One evening, exactly 6 months after the day Elena had first repaired Adrian's tie, they stood together on the balcony of his mansion. Elena was wearing a beautiful dress that Adrian had commissioned from a supernatural seamstress, made from fabric that shimmered like starlight and fit her perfectly. "Do you ever regret it?" Adrian asked, his arms wrapped around Elena from behind. "Leaving your old life for this one?" Elena leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady connection between them through their bond. "How could I regret finding my other half?" she said softly. "My old life wasn't really living, Adrian. It was just surviving, just going through the motions. This is living." Even with all the complications, the danger, the secrecy, the fact that you're bonded to a creature that most people would consider a monster, Elena turned in his arms to face him, seeing her own love reflected in his dark eyes. "Especially because of all that. Adrian, before I met you, I was invisible. I fixed other people's beautiful things, but never had anything beautiful of my own. Now I'm part of something extraordinary. I have purpose, adventure, and most importantly, I have you." Adrian's smile was radiant in the moonlight. "I was dead long before I became a vampire," he said quietly. "Just existing, accumulating wealth and power, but never really living. You brought me back to life, Elena. You made me remember what it feels like to hope, to dream, to love." 6 months later, on the anniversary of their first meeting, Adrian proposed to Elena in Mrs. Chen's fabric shop, the place where their story had begun. Mrs. Chen had closed the shop early, decorated it with thousands of tiny lights, and invited Marcus and several other supernatural friends to witness the moment. Adrian knelt among the bolts of silk and cotton, holding out a ring that had belonged to his human mother 2 centuries earlier, a simple but elegant sapphire that caught the light like captured starlight. Elena said yes through happy tears, and their wedding was celebrated by both the human and supernatural communities, a symbol of the bridge they had built between 2 worlds. Elena Rodriguez, who had once struggled to pay rent and lived alone above a fabric shop, became Elena Blackwood, partner to a vampire CEO and ambassador between the human and supernatural worlds. But more than that, she became living proof that sometimes the most broken things could be made not just whole again, but more beautiful than they had ever been before. The tie she had repaired that first day became a treasured keepsake, framed and displayed in Adrian's study as a reminder of how their love had begun. It served as a symbol of their relationship, something that had seemed ruined beyond repair, made stronger and more beautiful through patience, skill, and love. When other supernatural beings asked Elena how she had managed to capture the heart of one of the most powerful vampires in North America, she would smile and tell them the truth. She had simply seen past the damage to the beauty beneath, and had been willing to do the careful work necessary to make something precious whole again. And in the end, that was exactly what love was, the willingness to see the potential for beauty in something others might consider beyond saving, and the dedication to do the patient, careful work of repair. Elena had mended more than just Adrian's tie that day. She had mended his soul, just as he had mended hers. Together they built a life that was far more extraordinary than either of them could have imagined. Proof that sometimes the most unlikely love stories are the ones that last forever, and that true love really can conquer all, even the boundaries between life and death, human and supernatural, ordinary and extraordinary. Elena Rodriguez had always believed that fate worked in mysterious ways, but she never imagined it would lead her to the most dangerous and beautiful man she had ever encountered. Living in a cramped studio apartment above Mrs. Chen's fabric shop in downtown Seattle, Elena scraped by doing alterations and repairs for wealthy clients who barely acknowledged her existence. At 26, Elena had calloused fingers from years of needlework and dreams that seemed as threadbare as some of the clothes she mended. Her mother had died when she was 18, leaving behind a mountain of medical debt that Elena was still paying off. Her father had disappeared long before she could remember him, leaving only a faded photograph and her mother's stories of a man who promised the world but delivered only heartbreak. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Elena woke to the sound of rain pattering against her single window, the gray Seattle sky matching her mood as she counted the meager bills in her wallet. She had exactly $40 to last the week, and rent was due in 5 days. Mrs. Chen had been patient, but Elena could see the worry lines deepening around the elderly woman's eyes every time the subject of money came up. Elena made herself a cup of instant coffee with water heated in the microwave and stared at the pile of work waiting on her small table. A bridesmaid dress with a torn hem, a businessman's suit jacket with a cigarette burn, and a silk scarf that needed delicate re-embroidery. Each piece represented a few precious dollars, but it never seemed to be enough. The bell above Mrs. Chen's shop jingled around 10 in the morning, but Elena was too absorbed in her work to pay attention. She was carefully removing a wine stain from an expensive white dress shirt when she heard Mrs. Chen's voice, unusually flustered, calling from below. "Elena! Elena, come down here, please. There's a gentleman who needs help, and he says it's urgent." Elena sighed, setting down her stain remover. Mrs. Chen rarely sounded this nervous, and the word urgent usually meant someone was willing to pay extra. Elena couldn't afford to ignore potential income, no matter how tired she was. She made her way down the narrow stairs, her worn sneakers silent on the wooden steps. The shop smelled of fabric softener and the jasmine incense Mrs. Chen always burned. Bolts of colorful fabric lined the walls, and the old sewing machines hummed quietly in the corner where Mrs. Chen's other seamstresses worked. Standing near the front counter was a man unlike anyone Elena had ever seen. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with jet black hair that looked like it had been styled by expensive professionals. His skin was pale, almost luminous, and his features were sharp and aristocratic. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit that probably cost more than Elena made in 6 months, but something was wrong. His tie was completely ruined. It looked like it had been grabbed and twisted, the silk fabric torn in several places. There was also what looked like a small bloodstain near the knot, though the man showed no signs of injury. His dark eyes, an unusual shade that seemed to shift between brown and gold in the light, met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You must be Elena," he said, and his voice was like velvet over steel, with just a hint of an accent she couldn't place. "Mrs. Chen tells me you're the best seamstress in the city." Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks. She was acutely aware of her appearance: faded jeans with patches at the knees, a simple cotton blouse that had seen better days, and hair pulled back in a messy bun secured with a pencil. Standing before this immaculate stranger, she felt like a sparrow next to a hawk. "I do my best," she managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. "What can I help you with?" The man gestured to his ruined tie with what might have been embarrassment, though it was hard to tell with his composed demeanor. "I have a rather important event this evening, and I'm afraid I've had a small accident with my tie." Chen mentioned that you might be able to work miracles. Elena stepped closer to examine the damage, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened when she caught his scent, something like cedar in winter air, completely unlike any cologne she'd ever encountered. The tie was expensive silk, probably Italian, and the damage was extensive. Most seamstresses would have declared it beyond saving. "This is going to be challenging," Elena said honestly, running the silk between her fingers. The fabric was incredibly fine, and the tears were in delicate places. The blood stain might come out, but these tears, it's going to require some very precise work. "Money is no object," the man said quickly. "I'm willing to pay whatever it takes." Elena looked up at him, surprised by the urgency in his tone. There was something almost desperate in his dark eyes, though he was trying hard to hide it. "Can I ask what kind of event you're attending? It might help me determine the best approach for the repair." For a moment, something flickered across his features. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "My wedding," he said quietly. "I'm getting married tonight." The words hit Elena like a physical blow, though she couldn't understand why. She didn't even know this man's name, yet something about the way he said wedding made her chest tighten. She forced herself to focus on the professional task at hand. "Congratulations," she said, though the word felt strange in her mouth. "When do you need this finished?" "The ceremony is at 8 this evening." "I know it's short notice." Elena glanced at the clock on the wall. It was already past 10:30. She would have less than 9 hours to perform what was essentially a miracle. The smart thing would be to recommend that he buy a new tie, but something about his expression stopped her. There was a story behind this damaged tie, something important. "What's your name?" she asked suddenly. He seemed surprised by the question. "Adrian Blackwood." The name sounded familiar, but Elena couldn't place it. "Well, Mr. Blackwood, I think I can save your tie, but it's going to take most of the day and I'll need to charge accordingly for the rush job." "How much?" Elena did quick calculations in her head. The work would be intricate, time-consuming, and she'd have to put aside all her other projects. Under normal circumstances, she'd charge maybe $50. But this man clearly had money and she desperately needed it. $200, she said, expecting him to balk. "Done," Adrian said immediately, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a wallet that was probably worth more than Elena's monthly rent and counted out 4 $50 bills. "Half now, half when you're finished." Elena stared at the money, more cash than she'd seen at one time in months. "I haven't finished yet. You might want to wait." "I have faith in your abilities," Adrian said, pressing the bills into her hand. His fingers were cold, she noticed, cold as winter despite the mild temperature in the shop. "Mrs. Chen spoke very highly of your work." Mrs. Chen beamed from behind the counter, clearly pleased with the transaction. "Elena is artist," she said in her accented English. "She made beautiful things from nothing." Adrian's eyes never left Elena's face. "I believe it," he said softly. There was something in his gaze that made Elena feel exposed, as if he could see past her careful composure to the struggling woman beneath. She clutched the money tighter and nodded briskly. "I'll get started right away. Can I reach you at a number when it's finished?" Adrian handed her a business card that was heavy stock, embossed with elegant lettering. Adrian Blackwood, CEO, Blackwood Enterprises. There was a phone number below, nothing else. "I'll call you by 6, Elena promised. "That should give you time to get ready for your," she swallowed hard, "wedding." "Thank you, Elena," Adrian said, and the way he spoke her name made something flutter in her chest. "You have no idea how much this means to me." After he left, Mrs. Chen bustled over with undisguised curiosity. "Very handsome man," she said with a knowing smile. "Very rich, too, I think. You be careful, Elena." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Chen's expression grew serious. "Some men, they have secrets. Dark secrets. Do. You just be careful, okay?" Elena nodded absently, already focused on the task ahead. She carried the ruined tie upstairs to her workspace and laid it out under her strongest lamp. In the bright light, she could see that her initial assessment had been correct. The job would be nearly impossible. But as she began to work, carefully separating the torn threads and planning her approach, Elena found herself thinking not about the difficulty of the task, but about Adrian Blackwood himself. There had been something almost otherworldly about him, something that made her ordinary little world seem suddenly full of possibilities. She worked steadily through the morning, her fingers moving with practiced precision as she coaxed the damaged silk back into shape. The bloodstain came out more easily than she'd expected, almost as if it had never fully set into the fabric. The tears were more challenging, requiring her to essentially reweave sections of the silk using threads she carefully extracted from the seams. Around noon, Elena took a break to eat a sandwich and rest her eyes. She found herself staring at Adrian's business card, wondering what kind of man could afford to pay $200 without blinking for a tie repair. More importantly, what kind of man got married on a Tuesday evening? And why had he looked so sad when he mentioned the wedding? Elena shook her head, trying to focus on her work rather than her mysterious client. She had no business wondering about Adrian Blackwood's personal life. He was clearly from a different world, the kind of world where ties cost more than her monthly grocery budget and weddings were probably elaborate affairs with hundreds of guests. But as the afternoon wore on and her work progressed, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that there had been something desperate in Adrian's eyes, something that went beyond mere concern about his appearance. The way he'd clutched the ruined tie when he first walked in, as if it were precious to him, suggested that this wasn't just about looking good for his wedding photos. By 4 o'clock, Elena had made remarkable progress. The tears were nearly invisible now, the silk threads rewoven so carefully that only an expert would be able to tell there had ever been damage. She was working on the final section when she noticed something odd. As she held the tie up to the light to check her work, she could swear she saw something moving in the fabric pattern. It was probably just fatigue. She'd been working for hours under intense concentration, but for a moment the geometric design seemed to shift and writhe like something alive. Elena blinked hard and looked again. The tie appeared perfectly normal, the pattern static and elegant as it should be. She rubbed her eyes and went back to work, chalking up the illusion to tiredness and too much caffeine. By 5:30, the tie was finished. Elena held it up, amazed at her own work. Not only was the damage completely repaired, but somehow the tie looked even better than it had originally. The silk seemed to shimmer with an inner light, and the pattern was crisp and perfect. Elena wrapped the tie carefully in tissue paper and called the number on Adrian's business card. He answered on the first ring. "Elena?" His voice was eager, almost anxious. "It's finished," she said simply. "You can pick it up whenever you're ready. I'll be right there." He arrived less than 15 minutes later, which was impossible given that his business address was across town. Elena didn't have time to puzzle over this because the moment Adrian walked into the shop, all her attention focused on him. He looked even more striking than he had that morning, if possible. His hair was perfectly styled, and he wore a fresh shirt that was so white it almost hurt to look at. But there were shadows under his eyes, and his face was drawn with what looked like exhaustion or stress. "Let me see it," he said without preamble. Elena unwrapped the tie carefully, watching his face as she revealed her work. Adrian's expression went through a series of changes: surprise, relief, and something else that looked almost like awe. "This is extraordinary," he said quietly, taking the tie in his hands. "It's perfect. Better than perfect on." "I'm glad you're satisfied," Elena said, though she felt oddly deflated. Once he left, she would probably never see him again. He would go to his wedding, marry whatever beautiful, wealthy woman was waiting for him, and live his elegant life far away from her small world of needles and thread. Adrian was studying the tie intently, running his fingers over the section she had ripped. How did you do this? The damaged areas are completely invisible. Trade secret, Elena said with a small smile. You said money was no object, so I used some techniques I usually reserve for museum-quality pieces. Adrian looked up at her with an intensity that made her step back involuntarily. You have a gift, he said seriously. This isn't just skill, this is artistry. Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks again. It's just a tie repair, Mr. Blackwood. Nothing magical about it. Isn't it? Adrian's voice was soft, almost a whisper. He was still staring at her with those unusual eyes that seemed to catch and hold the light. Sometimes the most ordinary things can be the most magical of all. There was something in his tone that made Elena's breath catch. For a moment, the busy shop around them seemed to fade away, and there was only Adrian standing too close, looking at her as if she were something rare and precious rather than a struggling seamstress in patched jeans. Then Mrs. Chen cleared her throat loudly from behind the counter, and the spell was broken. Adrian stepped back, his expression returning to polite formality. He reached for his wallet and counted out the remaining $100. Thank you again, Elena. You've saved what could have been a disaster. Elena took the money with hands that trembled slightly. Good luck with your wedding, she said, though the words tasted bitter. Adrian paused at the door, his hand on the handle. For a moment, Elena thought he might say something else, something that would explain the strange connection she felt crackling between them. But then he simply nodded and walked out into the evening. Elena watched him go, noting absently that despite the rain, he cast no reflection in the shop's front window. She blinked, certain she must be mistaken, but when she looked again, Adrian was already gone, disappeared into the crowd of evening pedestrians as if he had never been there at all. That night, Elena lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of her strange encounter. She had enough money now to pay her rent and buy groceries, which should have made her happy. Instead, she felt empty, as if something important had been taken away from her before she even realized she had it. She found herself wondering about Adrian's wedding, imagining him standing at an altar somewhere in the city, placing that perfectly repaired tie around his neck before promising to love someone else forever. The thought made her chest ache in a way that was completely irrational. Elena closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her dreams were filled with dark eyes and cold hands, and the lingering scent of cedar and winter air that seemed to cling to her small apartment long after Adrian Blackwood had gone. Elena woke the next morning with an odd sense of anticipation, as if something momentous was about to happen. She made her coffee and settled down to work on her backlog of alterations, but found herself constantly glancing at the clock. Somewhere in the city, Adrian Blackwood was probably waking up as a married man, beginning his new life with someone who belonged in his elegant world. The thought should have been meaningless to her, yet it sat heavy in her chest like an undigested meal. Elena tried to focus on the bridesmaid dress she was hemming, but her stitches were uneven, her mind elsewhere. Finally, she set the work aside and decided to take a walk. The morning was crisp and clear, yesterday's rain having washed the streets clean. Elena wandered aimlessly through downtown Seattle, her feet carrying her past coffee shops and boutiques she could never afford to patronize. She was standing outside a newspaper stand, debating whether to spend 50 cents on a paper when she saw the headline, "Blackwood Wedding Called Off at Last Minute." Elena's hand shook as she fed coins into the machine and pulled out a copy of the Seattle Times. The story was on the front page of the Society section, accompanied by a large photo of a stunning blonde woman in an elaborate wedding dress, her face tear-streaked and furious. Victoria Ashford, 28th daughter of prominent real estate developer Richard Ashford, was left at the altar last night when her fiancé, Adrian Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, failed to appear at their scheduled ceremony at the Four Seasons Olympic Hotel. The lavish affair, attended by over 300 guests, was called off after Blackwood sent word that he could not go through with the marriage. Miss Ashford declined to comment, but sources close to the family suggest she is devastated by the public humiliation. Elena read the article twice, her heart pounding. Adrian hadn't gotten married. He had run away from his wedding, left his bride waiting at the altar in front of hundreds of people. The rational part of her mind knew this was terrible for everyone involved, but a treacherous flutter of hope rose in her chest anyway. She folded the newspaper and tucked it into her bag, then continued her walk with no particular destination in mind. Elena found herself thinking about the way Adrian had looked when he mentioned his wedding, not like a happy groom, but like a man facing execution. Had he known then that he wouldn't go through with it? Had their brief encounter somehow played a role in his decision? Elena shook her head at her own foolishness. A man like Adrian Blackwood didn't change his life plans because of a conversation with a seamstress. More likely, he'd had second thoughts about his fiancée that had nothing to do with Elena at all. She was just a convenient person who happened to repair his tie on the day he decided to run away from his responsibilities. Still, Elena couldn't stop thinking about the intensity in Adrian's dark eyes, the way he'd looked at her as if she were something precious. Poor Seamstress Mended Vampire CEO's tie pre-wedding. He ditched the wedding and chose her.